Yes, please. Yes, then.
Okay, well, Professor Alex Boulton is going to talk about visualizing data-driven learning research today. Alex Boulton is a professor of English and Applied Linguistics at the University of Lorraine and former director of the TELIC Research Group. He is editor of Recall, published by Cambridge University Press, and is on boards and committees for Eurocall, which stands for the European Association for Computer Assisted Language Learning, TELC, which stands for Teaching and Language Corporal, and AFLA, Association Française de l'Équipe, as well as for various scientific journals. Particular research interests center on corpus linguistics and potential uses of ordinary teachers and learners, aka data-driven learning, with numerous publications in this era, including several syntheses of data-driven learning in recent years. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can still hear me and see me and see the slides anyway. Yeah, so visualizing DDL research today. Thank you very much, Yazdan and Amin, for inviting me and for organizing the conference as well. And thank you everybody for being here today. There are two strands. I mean, anybody who's heard me talk in the last few years will not be surprised by the type of thing I'm saying, although it is new information. If anybody's coming to ILA next week, the International Association for Applied Linguistics in Lyon in France, we'll be talking about similar things with Nina Viakina, so don't bother coming to both. Okay, visualizing DDL research today. Has the screen changed? Can you see a different screen now? Is there anybody there? Good.
I can see two themes.
Yeah. What?
I can see two themes, that slide.
Yes, that's right, two themes, yes, sorry. Okay, just sometimes the slides don't change. So there are two themes to my talk today. The first is data-driven learning. What do we mean by data-driven learning? Well, using the tools and techniques of corpus linguistics for teaching and learning a foreign or second language. To give you an idea of what it looks like, we're going back quite a long time to the early days. This is a screenshot from Tim John's paper in 1990. You use a corpus and you look for a particular word or set of words, and it aligns in the middle, and you can look on the left, and you can look on the right, and you can see how language is used in context. So for example, here, you've got propose, recommend, suggest, that, and then all of the contexts have should in the first group, 1 to 8. In the second group, you also have propose, recommend, suggest. In the middle, you have that. And on the right, you don't have should, but you have the base form of the verb, like the infinitive, but without to. Harvard, create. This paper, be rejected. So it's just a way of seeing how language functions in context, not being taught rules, which are quite difficult to assimilate, but from seeing it yourself. So by trying to detect patterns and looking at examples. So that's the first strand. The second strand is research syntheses. An interesting paper by Chong and Plonsky out recently in Advanced Access that's available. The point of research synthesis is not to do what you do normally in the introduction to a paper, which is you choose a few studies here and there, which either you agree with and support your opinion, or which are easy to criticize. The point is to be systematic about it, whether you're qualitative or quantitative, but to be really systematic about your how you look at past research. So the real question that interests me is what's going on in data-driven learning research today. Well, I could say, well, I've been working on this for 10, 15 years. I'm an expert, I know, but that's not really a very satisfactory kind of position, because I could show you anything and you could just believe me or not. I need proof, I need evidence. Here's a famous quote. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. If you recognize that, it is, of course, Sherlock Holmes. So not perhaps the best scientist example, but the principle is there. We can't just theorize, we need to look at facts. And that's the same with an individual study and with a research synthesis. It's particularly a problem in fields such as education or applied linguistics, because all the studies that are published work pretty much. And you can always find a study somewhere which supports your point of view. That doesn't mean that all studies are equal. You need to be rigorous and systematic and methodical excuse me, in collecting all the studies and then analysing them. So just research in general, it's particularly for DDL, but it works for other fields in applied linguistics as well. When you have a new domain of research which comes along, the first papers which are published tend to be descriptive or speculative, and only later on do you get empirical studies which actually seek to evaluate something. But this is incremental, additional, not subtractive. So it doesn't mean that empirical studies have replaced descriptive or speculative studies. You still get those types of studies today, but you also have empirical studies. And after a few years, you get a lot of empirical studies, hundreds, with Nina Viatkina, a paper in Language Learning and Technology, published in 2021. We found 489 such studies, empirical evaluations of DDL, and today I've got nearly 700 in my collection. So you need to have some systematic way of, firstly, collecting all of these. You can't happen to find them, and also in how you look at them. And there have been over 20 syntheses of data-driven learning to date. There's an evolution there as well. The first ones tend to be small scale and later moving on to larger scale. The first ones tend to be narrative reviews, so descriptive, and the later ones might be more meta-analytical, so putting together the numbers, the results, to combine those into a meta-analysis. And you also get various strange ones, miscellaneous ones, for example, Pascual Perez, a multi-word keyword analysis of data-driven learning, or a bibliometric analysis by Dong et al., published in 2023 in Recall. So what do we know from syntheses? Well, firstly, there's a lot of research, and you can't know it all well. The second thing is that DDL works. Various syntheses are encouraging, promising. It shows it works, but it doesn't work equally well everywhere. Some studies give better results than others. Some studies are better quality, perhaps, studies than others. So there is a lot of variety, and that's a variety that we need to take into account in any type of synthesis. So back to my basic question, what's going on in DDL research today? Following on from the paper with Tom Cobb in 2017 in Language Learning and the one with Nina Viatkina in Language Learning and Technology, we're using the same basic methodology, systematically collect published empirical data-driven learning studies. In the data set I'm presenting today, this goes up to 2021. We haven't included 2022 yet. All the papers are published in English. They're all research articles, and they're all published in JCR ranked journals in linguistics. Okay, this has advantages, is that we can be almost certain that we've got almost all of the papers which correspond to these criteria. But there's an awful lot that's not included. Papers published in other languages, papers which are not published as journal articles, but book chapters or conference proceedings or PhD theses, or which are published in other journals which don't have an impact factor, or journals which might be in education but in linguistics. So we're exhausted for what we've got, but it's not everything by any means. Another advantage is that research articles published in these journals, the journals, because they have an impact factor, that means that they're quite widely cited, although we have to be relative in our fields. The journal I edit, Recall, has an impact factor of 4.5 this year, which means that each article is published on average 4.5 times. And we ranked 7th in the entire field of linguistics. But my daughter just published a paper in Nature Biology, and that journal is ranked 30. So we have to be a bit modest about what that means. And also we need to be careful. It doesn't mean that all the papers published in these journals are quality papers. You do get varying quality. Perhaps not extreme variations of quality, but you do get variations. Impact is not the same thing as quality. So 3 more specific research questions. What trends are emerging in DDL research? And for this, we read all of the papers and we coded them for analysis. Second question, how do researchers talk about DDL, the actual language that they use? For that, we made our collection of research articles into a corpus to look at with Anconc. And thirdly, what does DDL look like? The screenshots which researchers publish in their papers. Just quickly, this is the overall output of papers which correspond to our criteria today. So you can see the red columns at the bottom are the number of papers, research articles in those journals published each year, and the black columns, that's the cumulative output. So we're up to about 150 papers so far. And because we're interested in today, by today, I don't just mean today, but say the last 5 years, or 2017 to 2021, compared to the previous 20 years. Okay, so you can see we have about 50 papers in the last 5 years and about 100 papers in the 20 years before that. So the rate is increasing. The journals mainly involved, well, Recall, Call, Language Learning and Technology and System have all published more than 10 empirical DDL surveys over the years. You can see that on the right. So our first research question, what trends are emerging? The manual coding and analysis. So this is what the coding sheet looks like. In fact, this is a small part of the coding sheet. It's not all of it. Nina Diakina and I have been through all of this. We've tried to establish inter-rater reliability, but there are many, many decisions to be made. We don't always agree, and somebody else wouldn't agree with us. So I can't say this is absolutely 100%. The figures I'm going to give you are true and right, but they're indicative. And the coding sheet is in different colors for different things: publication data, population data, treatment data, and research design. So let's just go through some of the things which are quite noticeable. So comparing the earliest corpus, the first 20 years, with the last 5 years, we see that the total output has gone up. It increased from about 5 papers per year to over 10 papers per year in the last 5 years. So there is increasing output. Asia and the Middle East were heavily represented, and now in the last 5 years represent just over half. Conclusions, I'll let you interpret that as you wish. Population data, the types of students involved, there has been criticism in the past, or comments in the past, that data-driven learning was mostly in university contexts for learning English as a target language at higher intermediate or advanced levels of language ability. That was true, and it's even more true today. Over 90% of papers are for learning English in a university context. So why? Well, maybe that's where researchers work, and those are the students that they have. Maybe we just don't have enough contact with teachers and other types of institution or other languages. Or maybe because DDL only works there, but if we don't research it, we won't know. So I'd love to see lots of studies outside university for other languages and at different levels of ability. Treatment data, well, the mean duration of studies is decreasing, surprisingly. I wouldn't have noticed that if we hadn't really done the rigorous tools and the rigorous annotation, but the mean and the median are both decreasing, which is perhaps not a good thing. Depends on the type of study, but all the same. The main objective, most studies are language for general purposes, but language for specific purposes, there were 14% in the first period, first 20 years, but in the last 5 years, there were no studies at all that had language for specific purposes. But language for academic purposes has increased. Okay, again, you can interpret that in different ways and come to your own conclusions about what it means. Interaction, I was surprised that the number of studies where students actually interact directly hands-on with a concordancer has decreased slightly. Those where a corpus is integrated into a broader CALL package, computer-assisted language learning package, has increased a bit. But in particular, the number of studies which use paper-based data-driven learning, so the students don't do it on a computer, the teacher prints out data and gives it to the student or projects it onto a screen, those have gone up. It's almost doubled. Very surprising. Wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't done this kind of coding, you see. When the studies are hands-on, so that's 74 in the first period and 38 in the second, sometimes we actually know the name of the software that was used. So Wordsmith Tools is going down, LexTutor is going down. People are using their own tailor-made software less often. You do get things like Sketch Engine, in particular AntConc, making quite a strong showing in recent years. Sometimes it's not separate software, but it's an integrated corpus and software platform. For example, it used to be hosted at Brigham Young University, BYU, created by Mark Davies, but now on english-corporate.org. That's gone up. 30% of all studies in the last 5 years were using that platform, or not maybe exclusively, but it featured in their studies, and MyCase and MyCusp as well for academic language. Named Corpora, the BNC, British National Corpus, featured in 50% of studies in the first period. Now it's COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English, which occurs in nearly half of all studies in the latest period. Size, if you have cut-off points at 1 million and 100 million words, The median bracket is staying stable at about a third of all studies. The smaller corpora are less popular today. That coincides perhaps with what we saw, there are less specialized studies, fewer studies in language for specific purposes. But the larger corpora, over 100 million words, are becoming more popular. And also on size, we're seeing actually less variety, partly because the large public corpora come to dominate, and people don't have time or the inclination to build smaller corpora, their expectations for large corpora. So we have no hands-on concordancing studies with corpora of graded readers in the last 5 years, none with newspaper corpora, none with literary corpora, people like to read, none with textbooks or manuals, and no parallel corpora of translation studies, but a few more student-built studies. I'll put those as raw numbers, not percentages. So again, you can draw the conclusions you like from this basic data. Language focus hasn't changed so much. DDL has always been recognized as being mostly for vocabulary or lexicogrammar. That's still the same today. Perhaps it's a shame the other things are mostly going down. When it comes to skills, DDL has been pretty much dominated by writing, but that's become even more true in recent years, over 80%. Other skills are going down or disappearing. Translation in particular, right down from 24% to only 5%. Research design, the mean sample size is increasing, but sample size is all the participants. It includes control groups and it includes more than one experimental group. So there are more studies in the last 5 years which have an experimental and control group, or which have 2 experimental groups. So the sample size is increasing, but it doesn't mean the group size is increasing. It tends still to be an intact class. I'm a teacher, this is my class of students, and I'm doing DDL with them. The number of purely qualitative studies is decreasing. When we say qualitative, I mean which don't give any numbers, that they interpret the data qualitatively. Some of them do have at least some raw numbers or percentages or descriptive statistics. That's a slight increase there, and also a slight increase for ones which have at least some more advanced statistical analyses. Okay, now the size of the group depends on whether you can do statistical analyses, and the type of data analysis you do depends on your objectives. If you're interested in outcomes, then you're looking at corpora as a learning aid or reference resource, the first 2 there. But you might be interested in more emic issues of what students do or what students think, taking into account their positions there. So not huge changes. And that also connects to the actual instruments used. So for learning and reference for outcomes, you've got tests or production. So perhaps we're moving a little bit away from kind of pre-test, post-test, or just tests with closed answers that are given, to analysis of learners' production. So in particular written production, but it could also be speaking production. EMIC tools or questionnaires have always been very popular, slightly less so. But very, very often they're not the main instrument in the study. They're sort of tacked on at the end somehow. Having looked at outcomes, now let's just see what learners think of it. Interviews and discussions also look at learners' attitudes and behaviour, possibly, but also through tracking and observation. So you can see the evolution here. So I'm not going to go into some kind of big discussion of all that so far. Move on to the second part, which is perhaps more interesting. How do learners talk about DDL? Well, I say more interesting, perhaps because it's more original. There are lots of syntheses which do code studies, but there are not many which actually convert their text into a corpus and analyze that using corpus tools. Simple corpus tool, AntConc, free, downloadable, very easy to, well, relatively easy to use. Mostly using version 4.2, though for one thing I did have to use the old version because I can't find out how to do it in the new version. I've asked Lawrence Anthony, he hasn't got back to me yet. So we've got 151 research articles using TagAnt, also free, to convert them into TXT format, UTF-8, and then edit them. We're interested in what researchers say, so we're not interested in the metadata, the affiliation, headers, footers, figures, tables, extracts, footnotes, references, appendices, acknowledgements, etc. So we got rid of all of that. But it needs a lot of checking, and it's quite time consuming to go through and check. It probably takes between half an hour, maybe a bit more. But most papers which are published in top journals are relatively easy to do, but if you go to other journals, it can be even longer. So that gives us this breakdown. You can see the number of papers in each corpus, each time period, and the total, and the number of tokens. So we've got in total nearly 1 million words 2/3 of which in the early period and a third in the second period, the recent period. We also used a stop list, the 200 most frequent words in the BNC, and we lemmatized using Tagant as well. Sorry, that's not Tagant, it's AND file converter, it should be at the top. 151 words put into AND file converter. Sorry, mistake on the slide there. Carrying on quickly. So the first thing that you can do when you have a corpus is to create a word list. So this shows you the most frequent words which occur in your corpus. So in the next few slides, all the time on the left, you can see the old period, 97 to 2016. And when I show you one on the right, you'll see it's the more recent, the last 5 years. So the most frequent words that we've got in the old periods are the, of, to, and in. And in the most recent period, we have the, of, and to, in. Same word, different order. Okay, not very revealing. But we do also have some words already like students, corpus and language in the earlier period and corpus, students, learners, use in the more recent period. So we're starting to see some themes which are emerging and which have in common as well. If you want to get rid of the small words, to look only at lexical words, content words, we can do that with a stop list and it just eliminates them. So now you can see we've got students, the most frequent lexical items are students, corpus, language, use, learners in the old period, and corpus, students, learners, use, language in the recent period. So this is more revealing, but what it's revealing is particularly that there are lots of things in common. Okay, and sometimes we forget about that. We only look at differences, and we forget there are lots of things in common. But having said that, if we do want to look at differences, we can do a keyword list. Now, a keyword list shows the words which are statistically significantly more frequent in one corpus compared to another. So it forgets what's in common, it only looks at differences. Okay, so on the left, you can see it's still a slight problem because we've got students and student which are counted separately. So it might be nice to put those together, and we can do that if we lemmatize the corpus. So it means that all forms of a noun, student and students, are together. Forms of a verb such as work, works, worked, working are counted as one item. Okay, so this is what we've got here. And Ancon does allow you a little visualization for that, which is not very scientific, but students like it. Okay, so you can see there are some things, for example, we used to talk a lot about student, now we talk more about learner, for example. But what we did with Nini Biakina is we put aside the statistics because you get quite complicated statistics of all kinds of things in Ancon, but just take the top 50 key lemmas in each corpus. In other words, the 50 words which are most typical of the first corpus compared to the second one, and the 50 items which are most typical of the second corpus compared to the first one. Okay, so here we have the list of 50. So we'll just go down the list on the left of the old corpus and see if we can find things which are necessarily different, but perhaps similar parallels. So the first item on the list is student, which is a person, and these are other words which involve people. So student, now we talk about learner, participant, apprenticeship, trainee teacher, or indeed trainee teacher. He and his were keywords in the old corpus. They're much less frequent in the recent corpus, not because we get less sexist, but because there were some case studies in the earlier corpora which are less frequent today. So it's more likely to talk about they. But native speaker often go together. We're more likely to talk about an expert today. Next item on the list, concordancer, reflects technology. So other items in connection with technology. It's interesting that concordancer and concordancing were key in the first period compared to the second period. That means they've not disappeared, but they're much, much, much less frequent items in the last 5 years. Okay, you can see some other words like app, for example, something didn't exist so much in the old days, does now. Next item, MP, stands for modal particle. There were several papers on this. This is for German, or que for French, and other specific languages, Chinese, German, French, Cantonese, English, and Russian. All of these languages were spoken about a lot in the earlier period and much, much less in the last 5 years. So it looks as if we're having a reduction. The only keyword language is Arabic in the last 5 years. Language focus, we used to talk about grammar. Now we talk more about error correction, especially for students doing their PhD thesis, so for writing. Compounds, more bundles of vocabulary. And translation, parallel, interpreting, bilingual, and translator, these are all words which have disappeared. Well, they're key words in the earlier corpus. And we saw that the number of papers with looking at translation or with parallel corpora has gone down. So we do get the two types of approach, the first type of approach with the coding and this type of approach with the corpus analysis. They support each other, they reinforce each other, which is nice to see. Next item, word bank, glossary. Exercises and close activities are quite controlled. Lesson is also controlled, but perhaps we're a little bit more open today. So we've gone through all the 50 words on the left. There are still 3 words which are in white, which we haven't commented on, but that's because they're words which don't have one particular meaning or a small number of specific meanings. They can mean lots of different things, or 2 or 3 or 4 different things in the context. So they don't actually reveal very much. You'd need to look at different meanings of those words. But on the right, you've still got quite a lot which is still in white. Do they have anything in common, these white words on the right in the recent corpus? In other words, words with key lemmas in the last 5 years. Well, they do. A lot of them are connected to doing research. Words like condition or variable, or people who are cited, et al., or researchers such as Libors, Kotos, etc., or RQ for research question, figure, submission, draft as learners upload their work, and that's what's analysed. So a lot of the words which are key in the recent corpus, we're talking about doing research in different ways, which is gratifying. It's nice to see. And that's supported. This is the one I had to use, Anconc version 3, is for a key n-gram analysis. With Anconc, you can only directly do a key word analysis, but there is a workaround in the old version. You can create an n-gram list of each corpus, and then you can compare them to see which one's a key. I can't find how to do that in Anconc version 4. If anybody knows, please let me know. But all of these key n-grams, so it's groups of 3 words in the left, 4 words in the middle, and 5 words on the right. These are all key, so they're statistically significantly more frequent in the recent period, 2017 to 21, compared to the earlier corpus. Okay, so we can see lots of these n-grams do indeed relate to research. There is still one item which I'd like to talk about on the right, which is DDL, a key word in the recent corpus. Now, my whole talk is about DDL, so how can DDL be a key item? Well, DDL is just a label for what people are doing. What these papers have in common is what they're doing, whether you call it DDL or something else. If you don't call it DDL, what do you call it? Well, you might call it concordancing, and we just have indeed concordancing in the earlier corpus. But the term DDL is more frequent in the last 5 years than the previous 20 years, even though the previous 20 years was twice the size. So it's almost twice as common per 1,000 words, and it's twice as common in terms of range, the number of papers it occurs in. So 83% of the papers in the last 5 years include the term DDL, whereas only 42% in the first period did. Okay, concordancing, it wasn't massively more frequent. Well, it was massively more frequent than in the first period and the second period, but it was still only 650 compared to 1,500 nearly. And you can see that. So this is the identity of DDL, how it's evolved over time. This is not very big, and it won't be very easy to see. Basically, you've got a lot of lines. Each line is one paper in our corpus. That's why on the left, the whole set of lines is about 100. And under 2017 to 2021, it's about half as big. It's 53, okay, compared to 98. But each line corresponds to one paper. And within each line, every vertical blue bar corresponds to one occurrence of DDL. Okay, so you can see early papers. Well, you had Gregory Hadley in 2002, a couple of papers by me in 2009 and 2010, where I mentioned the word DDL 33 times and 129 times, maybe excessive, my apologies for that. A special issue of Recall in 2014, which I co-edited with Pascual Perez Paredes, various other papers in 2015 and 16, and then you look in 2017 to 21, okay, a lot in 2017, 19 and 20. There weren't very many papers in 2018, only I think, was it 5 or 8? So these are all the ones which mention DDL at least 25 times. So you can see that it is increasing. It is becoming the way to talk about using corpora directly in language teaching and learning. A different way to visualize that is to look at the number of occurrences of DDL in each paper. So that's the graph at the top right. So you can see the figures there with the cutoff, there's a little green dotted line you can see in the middle. And in the second graph, the number of occurrences of DDL per 1,000 words. So in the first period, we can see it's quite flat. It's not mentioned very often at all. But it is, although there are peaks and valleys, it is still talked about more often today. So if we have the term DDL today, why didn't we use it before? Well, DDL was coined by Tim Johns, who was writing in the late 80s, 1990s, and a little bit in the 2000s as well. Unfortunately, he died in 2007 or 2008. I think his last paper was posthumous. When his first paper, when he really talked about this, he talked about concordancing. Okay, that was a paper in 1986. And in 1988, another paper actually included in the title classroom concordancing. But then in 1990, that was the first appearance in print of the term data-driven learning in the title of one of his papers. And that was republished in 1991 alongside another one, Should You Be Persuaded, 2 examples of data-driven learning. So we've moved from concordancing or classroom concordancing to data-driven learning. But his 2 papers on data-driven learning were published in a volume which was called Classroom Concordancing. And in the introduction to that volume, he talked about an application of computers to language learning that has come to be known as classroom concordancing or data-driven learning. So it sounds as if they're synonymous. But then 2 years later, in 1993, he published a paper called Data-Driven Learning, an Update, and he compares the earlier term of classroom concordancing and the new term of data-driven learning, with a difference. Classroom concordancing was for the technique and DDL for the methodology. Aha. But in 2002, Data-Driven Learning, the Perpetual Challenge, DDL is not a methodology, it's an approach. And it's an approach that I have, for want of a better term, named data-driven learning. And his final paper, in collaboration with 2 of his doctoral students in 2008, talked about corpus-based language learning. So people very often in this area, they look up to Tim Johns as being the founding father, the great name, but he was, well, I won't say confused, but he changed his mind all the time. So it doesn't really matter what label you give it. It's what counts is getting students to use the tools and techniques of corpus linguistics in their work. So those are the first 2 research questions. I won't go into more details, as I say, we'll get conclusions at the end. Stage 3, what does it actually look like? And here we're going to be taking screenshots from the research papers which researchers write. So what do the learners see today, or at least what do researchers show? Now, if researchers are including a screenshot in their publication, presumably it's because they think it's interesting, worth showing, they're proud of it, either because it's typical, representative of what their learners do, or because it's not typical, it's original, it's very new. Okay, so the question is, has it changed since the early days? Remember, this is what we said DDL looked like in the early days, a computer printout of a keyword in context, the key item in the middle. Has it changed since then? Well, the first 5 years, because this slide here was, this paper by Johns wasn't an empirical DDL study, so it wasn't included in our collection. But the first 5 years, there were only 8 papers, and 5 of them included a screenshot. The 2 on the left are by Tom Cobb, and he's using his own software on a small corpus. So the learners were working hands-on on a computer. But the other 3 all have computer printouts, so the students were working on paper. In Watson Todd, you can see a fairly typical keyword in context, capable and a short context left and right. In St. John, you don't have keyword in context, that layout, you have complete sentences. And it's for German, which is quite interesting. In Lynn Bowker's paper, you have the keyword in context, but you also have frequency information. So you can see the frequency of different items. But all of this was on paper. Okay, that's the totality of all the papers which included screenshots. I haven't included all the screenshots, but there were no other papers in the first 5 years which had screenshots. Moving on to 2017, there were quite a lot in 2017, partly because there was a special issue of Language and Learning and Technology, which I co-edited with Nina Vyatkina, and all of these first 5 papers come from that special issue. I can't see my notes, I'm afraid, so I'll just have to make this up as I go along. The first 2, Ackerley and Lenko-Szymanczka, used printed data. In Ackerley, that's what they worked with, but the screenshot for Lenko Szymanska is the learner still had to use the corpus hands-on to respond, to be able to match these sentences which were on paper. Bardovi-Harlig et al., they were looking at pragmatic issues, which is quite fun. In particular, you can see here, this was, I think it was my case, or was it my cusp? We have extended context as well. So it's spoken language, well, a transcription of a spoken language, and you can look for particular things, I agree, but, and you can look down and see that in the context, in the wider context of how people interact. On the right, you've got Han and Shin, who use Google, or more specifically Google Scholar. Do you conduct research or conduct a research? And using inverted commas, you can see that both exist, but they don't have the same frequency. And if you have conduct a research, it's normally conduct a research study or conduct a research interview, for example. So research is not the head noun. And Kotos et al. Was also interesting, a bit like Bardovi and Harlig, looking at pragmatics, but here particularly for moves and steps, if you're familiar with Swalesian terminology. So discourse, at the level of discourse. Also 2017, but from different sources. Leso and John, they used Ankonk, which we've seen before, but they used Silex as well. They were interested in bundles, so not keyword in context, but groups of words which occur particularly frequently. The next three all used BYU corpora as they were, invented by Mark Davies, now available on english-corpora.org. The BNC in the two ones in the middle for Smirnova and Lee et al. And on the right for, I can't see all of his name because it's hidden by the, there we go, Nurmagomedov in International Journal of Lexicography. This was actually based on wordandphrase.info, but it's based on COCA, Corpus Contemporary American English. So you can see here, not specifically the concordance lines, but the distribution of different parts of the corpora, different definitions and so on. And at the bottom we have Naismith. Well, we mentioned Google Scholar earlier. Naismith was looking at Google Books Viewer, so just for frequency. But you can see that some terms are increasing in frequency from Google Books. Is it a corpus? Well, some people would say yes, some people would say no, some people would say it doesn't really matter, it's the tools and techniques that count. 2018. Interesting here, there were only 5 papers which met our criteria published in 2018, and only 2 of them included screenshots. And both of them used a representation similar to what I showed you earlier for DDL. In Charles, it's one student, a doctoral student, who had each chapter of her PhD looking at the occurrence, the frequency of occurrence of particular words in different chapters of her PhD. And in Chenna Flowerdew, this was a chemistry corpus, so looking at different parts, the abstract, introduction, methodology, results discussion, etc., with frequencies underneath as well. That was using BNC Web. 2019, Lin and Lee, printed materials. Bridal also using englishcorpora.org for distributions, for frequencies, and keywords in context. Tsai also using English Corpora just for keywords, or at least that's the only screenshot that we have. Alonso Ramos and Garcia Celida have an interesting tool which allows you to search basically what verb occurs before siesta in Spanish. So you can see echarse, well, I won't try to pronounce it because you'll do that better than me. Interesting on the right is Crossway et al. And they're using Hong Kong-based resource, which allows you to have keywords. But look at the second part with the coloured circles. It doesn't just give you these dried numbers and words, but it shows, by, in terms of colour and proximity, the words which are most frequent left and right of a target item. So it's a different way to visualise DDL. This is something which is quite original. And finally, at the bottom in the middle, I've got Perez Paredes et al. This is not actually an example of DDL, but was a screenshot in their paper. And I included it because it shows doing DDL on mobile phones. Okay, there's very little on that at the moment. It'd be nice to have more. So I did include it for that reason. 2020, we're getting towards the end. You'll be glad to know 5 out of 9 papers included screenshots. So we've got Dong and Lu and Saidakta et al. Both using Antconc. Li et al. Using COCA again. Lian Chang is interesting, a tool called Lingual, which is very simple to use, and a bit like what we saw earlier for the Spanish case, to acknowledge what verb do you use with knowledge. So you can see just frequencies, and if you click on it, then you can go further on, but they didn't include all of that as screenshots, but that's the type of thing students see there. Or Simon Smith in 2020 using Sketch Engine, which allows you to look at modifiers and word sketches. So you've got the left-hand column is modifiers of market. The search term was market, so stock market, efficient market, etc. And nouns modified by market in the middle, and other things on the right. So it's a different visualization of data from different software. Finally, 2021, the first three, Gilquin, Nergis, don't know how to pronounce that, and Zaki, were all using printed materials. 3 out of 5 of them back to printed materials. But not just regular printed materials, maybe in the case of Nergis, but in Gilquin, you probably can't see, it's probably too small, but in the chevrons, you've got different items. It's talk someone into doing something, or persuade someone into doing something, pressure someone into doing something. It's all different ways in complete context. And Zaki is, of course, interesting because it's for Arabic, which leads from right to left. But you can see the actual search term in the middle was the same in each case. So it's more traditional, quick in some ways, even though it's for Arabic. And that was printed, as I say. Schiffer-Lacroix, who's working on German in France, she used Sketch Engine for language learning. So it's a simple free version of Scale, which shows frequencies, and you can look at words in context. And on the right, Wu et al., they're looking at clusters or bigrams, 2 grams here. Okay, so those are my 3 data types, my 3 collections for my 3 research questions. Excuse me. So what can we say about all of this? I've been talking at you for about 40 minutes. Try and take a breather, take a step back. What does it say? Research syntheses are wonderful. They're really good things, and we need more of them. But they can be dangerous. If you think of, okay, someone's done a research synthesis, now we know everything there is to know. We don't. You need to be careful in interpreting a research synthesis, just as you need to be careful in interpreting a primary study. You've read studies before, and you see things you think, that's odd, or why did they do that? Or I wouldn't have done that. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. It's exactly the same with research syntheses. For example, our definition of DDL, the use of the tools and techniques of corpus linguistics for L2 language learning and use, not everybody would agree. Some people would say it must be a corpus. I would say no, it's the tools and techniques of corpus linguistics, even if it's not a corpus as such. I would be quite happy to include Google in there. Google is not a corpus. I would include that under DDL. Other people wouldn't. The objectives, we were only interested, I say we as Nina, Vietkina and me, in looking at empirical research studies, not ones which are descriptive or they give ideas of what you might be able to do. We wanted studies which actually evaluated something. Somebody else would have a different collection. Our inclusion criteria, up to 2021, what about 2022, 2023, advanced access? We're getting there. We only had papers published in English. If you know Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, you might include different papers, you might get different results. We only have research articles. What about book chapters, PhDs, conference proceedings? We could have included them, we didn't. Also, we only had ones which had a journal impact factor, so it's prestige, widely cited journals, and the ones in linguistics. But there are lots of other things as well which we didn't include because it would just be too much. Data extraction, well, this is our coding scheme and our corpus creation. Other people would code differently and could have it create a different corpus. Data analyses, how you put it together, how we interpret it. So all of these things, it means that our synthesis, which I presented today, is not the last word in data-driven learning, far from it. It does, however, allow us to have one way of taking stock of a large body of research in the past. And it also allows us to look forward to the future to see what hasn't been done or hasn't been done very much, and to identify gaps. So there are 2 advantages, nice things about synthesis, is to look at the past and take stock of the past, and to look to the future. Specifically on data-driven learning, it is a growing field. 1/3 of all papers which correspond to our criteria were published in the last 5 years alone, well, 2017 to 21. Triangulation between the coding and the corpus analysis, they overlap, they coincide, they support each other, where they show the similar things. And also DDL, the term DDL, it's a thing, Before there were lots of different terms, but now it's DDL is the term which dominates this field. So we can call it DDL and people will know what we mean. More specifically on DDL, so remember my basic question, what does it look like today? So what's on the decline, what's on the increase, and what do we make of that? Well, a lot of the studies, as I said, are at university with English as a target language, advanced learners. I'd love to see more with other learners outside university, in schools, outside formal education, adult learners, in language schools, further education, languages which aren't just English, at different levels. What about beginners or people who've got different levels of ability? Translation is going down, writing is going up. I'm not actually sad that writing is going up, but it's sad that it's at the expense of everything else. What about spoken skills, receptive skills? So speaking and listening, is it possible to use DDL for those? Maybe we need to get a bit creative, but it ought to be. And if you are going to look at DDL for writing, just doing another writing DDL study is a bit, it's been done so many times, but there are different ways to do that type of research. You might compare two different corpora or two different tools or two different approaches using the same corpus and the same tool or two different student populations. So there are ways to do more interesting things even with written DDL. Vocabulary and lexicogrammar still dominate, not increasing or decreasing, but they're still dominant. What about discourse? I'd love to see more on that. And I'm involved in a project in France at the moment to see if we can use a data-driven approach to reading legal texts which have been annotated for moves and steps. So that should be quite fun to look at. Language for specific purposes going down, academic purposes going up. Maybe we could combine them. I'd love to see that. Well, generally an academic corpus does tend to be specialised, but the focus is on academic language. But if we could put that together, maybe learners could use the same corpus and tool to look at academic language, language in their speciality, and also content to find out information. If they've got their 10, 15, 20 papers in their field, put those together, they could find facts about the subject, not just language. If we could get colleagues involved in other fields, that would be, I think, great fun. Big corpora, the main tools are dominating, small corpora are disappearing, which is a bit sad because it'd be nice to have more specialised corpora and more variety of corpora. We're seeing less variety. Duration is going down, sample size is going up. That doesn't mean the group size is going up, and that tells us all kinds of things about validity and generalizability. Replication studies, collaborations. We need collaborative studies between researchers and teachers, but also between researchers and teachers with different student populations. Maybe some people in chemistry, some people in biology, in different institutions in the same country, or in different countries with maybe different languages, maybe all kinds of different things you could do. We could work together to do better on that. Fewer qualitative studies, more emic studies. What about mixed methods and the tools and statistics appropriate for that? Pre-test, post, well, that kind of test is going down. We're looking more at productions, which is perhaps a good thing because it's more ecological. And I think I'm on 48 minutes. So my last slide, I think, 3 points to make, 3 take-home messages. Yes, we need better research practices, naturally. We need to do better research, but we also need to report our research better. Take the example of duration. If a study says it lasted a semester, well, everyone knows what a semester means, but what does that involve? If you compare 2 extreme scenarios, you might have a 10-week semester where they did nothing, they didn't work on DDL in the first 2 weeks or last 4 weeks. That brings you down to 6 weeks. Maybe they only worked every second week. That brings you down to 3 weeks. They had 1 class a week and they only did 30 minutes of DDL. That's 1.5 hours of DDL in a semester. Now compare that to a 15-week semester. They worked on it every week. They had 3 classes. Each class was 4 hours long, entirely given over to the DDL. That gives you 180 hours of contact with DDL. Compared to the first definition of semester, it gives you 1.5. Now 1.5 compared to 180 is a huge difference. So we got to report this better. The same applies to proficiency. What do we mean by intermediate, advanced, etc.? The activities and the materials that people use, these are often not described in detail in the studies. Please, open science, give the materials online, give your instruments online, show us more screenshots of what people are actually doing. So that's my first point. Second point, we need more diversity, more originality. We need to go beyond concordance lines. There was a book by Pascual Perez and Geraldine Mark, published just a couple of years ago after one of the TAL conferences. So we need to go beyond concordance lines for different types of visualization. different corpus types, different tools, different interfaces, different ways of looking at it. We need to have more DDL on mobile phones. Students use mobile phones. We've got to bring DDL to them, things which they can reasonably do on their mobile. And for spoken data, for example, it's not impossible to do DDL with spoken data. This is an example on the right from Youglish. You type in, for example, I was like. You can go from one video to the next, and you can see it. It's very tiny here, I know. But you can see it highlighted in yellow. You hear the you watch and hear the video a few seconds before and a few seconds after before you go to the next one. You can compare multiple occurrences of the same word or expression in context, in genuine context. My third point, my final point, I'm just on 50 minutes. We need to be better on researching the underpinnings of DDL, the processes involved. For example, it's often said that DDL promotes student autonomy, that DDL promotes noticing, it promotes language awareness, maybe it helps to produce better learners, but we don't actually know that. People do their research study, and because it works, they say, oh, well, that shows that it improves autonomy noticing and so on. It doesn't, that wasn't the actual research question. We need to have primary research questions which are devoted to these things. Now, of course, they're very difficult to research. How do you research? Does DDL make for more autonomous learners? Does DDL promote noticing, etc.? They're not easy things to think of. So we need to get our thinking caps on, not just as academics with our mortarboards and gowns, but to crazy thinking like Doc Brown in Back to the Future, or on the right, more naive thinking, go back to being little children again and trying to think of something completely outside the box. So that's my three takeaway messages: better research and reporting, more diversity and originality in visualizing DDL, and researching the underpinnings. Ta-da! Was that 50 minutes?
Right on time, Alex.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. Yazdan, would you please go ahead and start asking the questions that we have received, and you may want to start with your own question as always.
I mean, I'm looking at the boxes that we have. Nothing for the moment. Alex, I go ahead and start asking the first question. Cool. I actually got two questions and a request. Just before I forget, Alex, do you remember Tom Cobbs, because you mentioned his name several times? Do you remember his vocab assisted language learning website, which he designed for, you know, can we just, if you remember the URL, can I just post it in the chat box? Yeah, that one, Lex Tutor.
If you type in, if you Google Lex Tutor, all as one word, LEXTUTOR, it's actually .ca for .Canada. LexTutor.ca.
Yeah, I'm gonna post that for you. Alex, at the beginning of the talk, you listed the journals that have published data-driven learning studies.
Yeah.
Like, what does that tell you when you see that a large number of data-driven studies are published in non-call core journals? Like I could even see TESOL quarterly. What does that tell you?
It tells us that it's multifaceted, I think. That's, hold on, where are we? Just collect my slide.
What was the slide 5 or 6?
It's not necessarily computer-assisted language learning. It often is, because you've got recall, call, language learning and technology and system. They are all call journals, or system is debatably, but basically they're computer-assisted language learning journals, and that's where you find the majority. But you do also find DDL in Journal of English for academic purposes, English for specific purposes, International Journal of Applied Linguistics, lexicography, second language writing, language awareness, corpus linguistics. So all of these things, they're different aspects of DDL. It's not just one thing. It's multidimensional. And then you have quite more general journals as well, like ELT journal or modern language journal, that type of thing.
And those recent publications, do you think that's a very recent phenomenon, like the publication and appearance of DDL learning in non-call core journals, like, for example, Modern Language Journal, you think? Is that from 2017 to 2021, or?
I can show that again if I can share the screen again. Can you see that?
Yes, that's the
so
slide.
You can see by period. There were twice as many in the first period compared to the second, so you can't really look at just raw numbers. because you've got 98 in the early corpus and 53 in the second corpus. But you can see you've had these journals publishing small numbers. It's always existed, I think.
Yeah, I see. And Alex, if you don't mind, the second question is about the use of DDL for speaking skills. I think this was a future direction in your talk. If you can just, I don't know, come up with an idea so that I can get it from there, you know. So
what? Sorry.
The use of data-driven learning for speaking skills was one of your future directions.
Okay, well, I can show you an example if you like. Again, sharing screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Google. Okay. So you've got this. Sorry, this website. It's called Youglish. Okay. Youglish. You might think YouTube English. You're right. Basically, what it does is it goes out and it collects videos which have subtitles from YouTube. Okay, but it's not just for English. You can do other languages as well. You can do Arabic, Chinese, Dutch, and quite a few other languages. But usually, by default, it's on English. And I'm going to give examples in English. So you type in something. I think the example I gave was I was like. Okay, what does it mean? I was like. It can mean lots of things. But particular today in contemporary English, it's how you react to something. Your reaction was.
And this year it was more kind of like this kind of thing.
Okay, I was like, and you can watch the video, read the subtitle. Okay, it's one example, not very much. Click here, go to the next example.
So I was like, great idea. I'm gonna go. Odd. Like one of the.
And also, it's such a fixed phrase that it's not I was like. It's more like it's almost one syllable. Yeah. And you can see and hear lots of examples.
So I was like, all right, I'll build my sand.
You can become it. So he's like, yes, you are. You.
So I was like, dude, just do whatever makes the most sense.
Okay, so you've got multiple examples. You can't have them in a concordance with printed data, but it has the advantage of having the video and the sound, so you can get pronunciation as well. The other tools, there's another one called Play Phrase, which is a similar principle, but it's from TV series and films. Unfortunately, it's paying. If you've got the money, pay for it. It's nice to see actors that you recognize in English, at least. You've got TED conference spoken corpus, produced by a colleague in Japan, and you can do similar things with TED Talks there. So good fun. I think there's potential there we haven't explored.
I took a note of it. Thank you very much, Alex.
So Yazan, let me go ahead and ask the next question. So what are the implications of this research for practitioners and teachers, and how can these findings shape future directions in the field of language teaching?
People often say that data-driven learning is a marginal activity. Not many people are doing it. I would disagree, because what interests me is not concordancer and corpus, but it's using software to look for patterns or repeated language items from a large collection of data. So basically, even Google is a form of data-driven learning when you're using Google to look for language. Lots of people will Google their language answers. Now, if you use Google for one word, probably the first few pages will just be dictionary entries. If you go down to page 10 or 15 for a frequent item, you'll see lots of little examples in context. They're snippets, they're Google results, and Google is designed for looking for information, not language. So you're limited in what the type of query you can use. If you use inverted commas, you force Google for certain types of query, not allowing Google to interpret it for you. And that's a type of data-driven learning. Lots and lots of people are doing that. But if people are doing it anyway, it's like with ChatGPT, which lots of people are talking about at the moment. We've got two reactions. Some people saying, it's terrible, we should ban it, which is like calculators back when I was young, sort of in maths class. We weren't allowed to use calculators because you have to learn maths the old way. Or the alternative is to say, well, students are going to be doing it anyway. Let's teach them to do it well. I would say the similar type of thing with Google searches or using Lingui or anything else. Let's teach them to do it well.
Yeah, that's a very important point. There is another question. So we wanted to get your thoughts on using DDL as a self-study approach versus as a teaching strategy by teachers in actual classroom. So what are your thoughts on that?
As I say, a lot of people are doing it spontaneously, a kind of DDL. I think one of the objections that people have to DDL is it's time consuming. And that's true. If you have a word or 5 words and you do that using a DDL technique, it takes longer than just teaching them or getting them to use a dictionary. But if it does have these other benefits of creating more autonomous learners who are better at noticing and so on, then it's really worthwhile. And that's why we need to look at those questions.
John, go ahead. Do you want to?
I want to know if John would like to ask questions because he's going to present some. So I don't know if he wanted to test the camera or if he has a question. John, do you have a question that you want to ask?
We cannot hear you. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a question raised in the chat box, Alex. What is your experience with transcribing audios so that you can then analyze the texts, in brackets, the transcripts, as a corpus?
I've avoided it as much as possible. I have lots of colleagues who are interested in that. I've got enough to do already. I've got a doctoral student who's doing that. It's quite fun. It's very time consuming, but it depends on the type of, if you're interested in the content, and this is normally the case in the type of things which I do, when you've got interviews, for example, you're not interested in do people repeat the same, that kind of thing. You don't need to note that. So you can use basically an orthographic transcription. But if you're interested really in the language, that could be useful.
To elaborate on that, Alex, the attendee means creating his or her own corpus of the student audio files. I think that's why there are so many studies with writing and far fewer with speaking. To make the corpus, there are no good tools or apps, basically because they are designed to recognize native speakers and not foreigners speaking, for example, English. What solutions can you think of?
Well, you might say, okay, you've got videos and you've got the text. For example, films, TV series. You don't necessarily need to put them together directly, but you might, for example, have a student, and maybe each learner is different. They each have their own favorite TV series, but you can almost always find the transcripts online. They're not perfect transcripts, they're fan transcripts. But if you can show them how to download that, put that into TXT, you're watching an episode, and there's a word that you notice has occurred twice. Stop, put it on pause, or note down, and then go to the transcripts, scroll down, or if you can use a concordancer, look at how many, seeing the different occurrences in the context of one TV series, not in the British National Corpus or the Corpus of Contemporary American English, but seeing it in your context for your TV series or your one film. That could be really revealing, and that could be really motivating for learners. So it's not asking them to transcribe or align sound and video. It's doing the two things side by side, or maybe watching the video and just make a note of things to look at afterwards. And that could be fun to do in class as well. As I say, particularly if learners have different series that they like to have. In the old days when I was young, teachers used to love to come into class and show a video, or when I was just, but what video do you show today? There are so many. Some students will like this series and other students will hate it. So if they can each work on their own TV series, that's great.
Alex, I think you got that paper published with Nina with 500 papers. Now you have a corpus of 700 papers. Is that right? Is that the same corpus on your desk?
It's the same corpus, but I'm not trying to keep that rigorously and systematically because it's just too big. I don't have time to read all of those papers.
Collecting why did you keep collecting and make it 700?
Yeah, I'm collecting the ones I happen to find, but I'm not doing it systematic like I should do, because it's just too much. I don't have the time to collect them or to treat them. So we're concentrating to be rigorous about it. That's one reason why we're concentrating on a smaller corpus of research articles published in journals which have an impact factor according to JCR from Clarivate Analytics.
I understand. I'm muted.
That's the first time that it has happened to me during this conference. I'm proud of myself. 2 days, first time. So Dr. Boulton, there's another question. Basically, we want to know your thoughts on the age of the language learners. If you feel that, for example, data-driven learning, DDL, would be appropriate more with a certain, age group or not when it comes to using it as a teaching strategy.
Does age matter? Well, age matters perhaps for their ability in language. Is it appropriate for complete beginners? I mean, if you're at university level, you probably haven't got very many complete beginners. But it might be a question of language sophistication. If you're at university level, you've probably been learning some languages for several years. Whereas if you start at the age of 10, maybe they've had no language experience before. Or maybe it's a question of cognitive development. 10-year-old and a 20-year-old, they don't have the same brain. They don't see the world in the same way. My suspicion is that most research has been conducted at university simply because that's where researchers work, and they have their language, they teach language, and they have access to students. They don't have such easy access in schools. It means going outside their workplace, collaborating with a teacher and collecting data from somebody else's students. It's not so easy to do. You don't have so much freedom, and you're not interested in it because it's their students. I'm interested in my students. But you can do DDL with younger learners. It has been done with primary school students and even very, very young learners, but mostly for the mother tongue. So, for example, Henry Tyne in France has been working with very young learners comparing homophones, so the sound C, but it can be SES or CES or C''EST, lots of different things. And you explain rules to small children at primary level, it's difficult when they can see lots of examples in context. Say, oh, right, that's that. And rules are difficult intellectual things to master, whereas detecting patterns, it's a natural human thing. We do it all the time, every day. It's one reason, unfortunately, why we have sexism and racism and all kinds of things like that, because we're good at detecting patterns. Too good.
Alex, I think the age factor that Amin raised is pretty much like the proficiency, language proficiency factor that you mentioned in your talk. The bulk of the studies are focusing on advanced language learners because probably the researchers find it easy to deal with advanced language learners, for instance, not beginners. I think you mentioned that point as well.
But if you have corpora, it's partly because the language in a corpus might be too difficult, because real authentic language is complex. So how can you make language more accessible? Well, if you focus on a genre, I mean, if you're looking at blogs, for example, it could be all over the place. Whereas if you have scientific articles, there are kind of formulae that you follow and it's more or less correct if you choose your articles from particular journals. It's nothing to do with whether you're a native speaker or not, but you're an expert in a field and you've been accepted by the community, you published your paper. So the language is likely to be fairly reliable. Another way to go might be to say, well, what about simplified language? Can we use graded readers? Why not? Some people would say a graded read, so a book which has been written to include a maximum of 1,000 different frequent words or maximum of 2,000 different words. Maybe there are people that would make it more accessible to younger learners, or simply to give them topics which connect with their interests. If you're interested, you can do it. My daughter, when she was 11, she didn't speak English particularly, and we spoke a little bit of English at home, but she's French and we're in France, so French was a natural language. But she and a lot of her friends would read Harry Potter in English because they'd wait outside the shop on the day it was published to be the first in line and read it in English. And her friends as well, they don't have a British father, but they were motivated. They can do it. Why not?
That's correct. That's correct. I mean, do we have time for Mihawa's question as well? It's
yeah, I think we have two minutes. So if you can ask the question.
Thank you for an interesting talk, Alex. Giti also is thanking you in the chat box, Alex. Related to the animals questions, the previous question this attendee means, I'd like to ask another question. Do you think we can make use of automatic speech recognition system, especially commercial ASR, as a first step to transcribe audios, even for the audios produced by non-native speakers?
Definitely. It depends what you want to do. If you want to focus really, for example, on phonology and phonetics, then you want to have a really detailed, really clear, really careful transcription. You probably won't get much help from ASR, automatic speech recognition. If you want to create a largish corpus, you don't have much money, get a machine to do it for you. If you can, if you have the time, or if you have students in time in class, get them to do it, or if you can afford to pay somebody to do it, get them to at least sample extracts of the automatic speech recognition to have an idea of the reliability. If it's good enough for your purposes, it doesn't always need to be perfect. And this is one of the two very different philosophies in corpus creation. Some people want to create a perfect corpus, which means it's going to be quite small. Other people want to have a big corpus, which means it's going to be quite messy. So with your spoken corpus, do you want to have something which is perfect and small and something which is big but messy? If you can cope with mess, there's no data like more data, as John Sinclair used to say. That's one approach to corpus building. So you could quite quickly, if you got the money to pay just for the software, create a multi-million word corpus of transcription.
That's right.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boulton.
I just say one
really,
final thing. I put a link in the conversation. Shubsas et al., a paper published in Recall 2024. It's available online, but it'll be officially in the journal in 2024. The title is A Longitudinal Analysis of Highly Cited Papers in 4 Cool Journals. I mean, Yazdan Shubsas has been doing some great work on analysis here, and that's a great article from him, with a little bit of input from his doctoral supervisor and me, but it's 90% Yazdan. So a little plug for that, a little bit of publicity.
Yeah,
Thanks,
yeah.
guys.
Congratulations
Can't wait to
to
see you in
Yazdan
5
on
weeks
that.
in Iceland.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boulton, for your contribution to TELIC, and we appreciate your time and effort.
Thank you. I wish I could be here for more. I'm going to go have a quick breather outside, but I'll come back, but they will kick me out in an hour anyway because the university shuts early in the summer. But I'll be here for another hour. After
Okay, awesome. Thank you so
Thank you very
much.
much.
So